Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have a liftoff.
What's up, Doom Nation, and welcome back. You are listening to the Two Doom Men podcast. As always, your hosts, Skaggs and the Captain. And we got some news. We're here today, and we're going to be talking about what everybody else is talking about in the podcast world. Skaggs, let them know what we're doing.
Yeah, we're going to be giving our feedback, our comments, our thoughts on the big interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. I'll just start by saying I felt like that was a moment in history, man, that will be in some future history textbook somewhere. Not only for like actual global politics history, but I was also thinking just in terms of like the history of the shit that we do, this form of like independent journalism fighting back against the mainstream narrative. And it's Tucker, like he did work for the corporate press before, but he's independent now. I felt like it was a big monumental moment in the history of that. Like, this is our guy, and he went and did this kind of as an emissary for all of us in some way or another. So really, really thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you for the fact that it is a big moment in history, big moment in journalism, almost maybe turning back the hands of time on what journalism has become today. I was expecting like bombshell results to take place in this interview, and we got a lot of good information, don't get me wrong, but I was looking for like incriminating evidence, like they rigged the election, something like, you know what I'm saying? But I think it was great, but I have to straight up say, Vlad, if you ever give us another history lesson, I'm nuking Russia. At one point, I was so mind-numbingly bored with this fucking history lesson. Now, I understand the history lesson was an important aspect, and I say it all the time, people are wildly uneducated, and they need to understand the history of what has gone on to lead up to where they are today. And it's funny because if you catch him at the beginning, he's like, I will just take 30 seconds to a minute to tell you this. And here we are 35 minutes later. At one point, it was so boring that my stomach started to hurt to the point that I thought, is Russia deploying a new type of weapon that,
or are they launching the attack right now while everyone's paying attention to this 45-minute ramble?
Oh, God. And you know what? Social media wins the day. They have been ruthlessly going after him about, so what's your 5-year plan? Well, let me start in 250 BC.
Yeah, there was a lot.
We're going to get the whole history of the world.
There was a lot of really good Lord of the Rings memes where it was like, him talking about the history of Morgoth and Sauron, and all this stuff. So I loved hearing that for shit like that. A couple points you made. Let's go back to one of the first things you said, like turning the clock back on journalism. Yeah. The week leading up to this, you saw, and we're gonna have tweet. I have a couple
to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
To interrupt you, but it's easy at this point to call it, but the reaction was more fascinating than what took place. I mean, literally calling Tucker treason, for going over there and interviewing, and how dare should we get a perspective. And I got to say, like, I know the people who are listening to our show understand this, but for all the normies that, people of Doom Nation deal with on a weekly, daily, monthly basis, whatever, you got to, just reply to these people with, what is the problem with having perspective? Because that's what this is. It's a perspective piece. It gives you perspective from the other side. Skaggs, you have a child. If your child came running to you and said, little Timmy punched me in the eye, you go over to little Timmy's parents and go, what happened? What's the problem? Oh, well, it turns out little Timmy was hitting your child with a stick, and your kid hauled off and punched. Perspective. It's not just this one-sided blind rage of just loyalty. What's wrong? So reply to these lefty loonies or whoever is really against it. Like, what's the problem with having a little bit of perspective from the other side of the world?
Yeah, I agree with that, of course. What we were saying before we even planned on doing this episode, or when we were planning on doing this episode, like this whole thing could be one whole episode, and we could talk about the reaction prior, the content during, and the reaction after, which we'll kind of get a little bit into.
That's an episode in its own.
In of itself, yeah. So again, going back to what you were originally saying, you said a lot. So the first part, going back to kind of traditional journalism and tying that into everybody's reaction, calling Tucker a traitor, and all these things. I mean, throughout the whole week while people were doing this, people were also sharing old journalism of CNN anchors going to interview like Osama bin Laden in 1997, Saddam Hussein,
Vladimir Putin.
The interview, I think it was Dan Rather, perhaps. I'm not sure. I could be wrong on that one, but it might have been Dan Rather and Saddam Hussein before Iraq War II. Like the weapons of mass destruction. And boy, I watched that one. Wow. If you would, now we all know, obviously, the weapons of mass destruction was a fucking lie. In it, Saddam Hussein says it was a lie and he didn't have any weapons of mass destruction right there in that interview. Yeah. So you're right. Like, we're kind of going back in a way to that brand of journalism, which is a good thing. It's always good to hear. So I think it's valuable, and anyone should, you should share this this interview to your normie friends. I think me and you perhaps might have been a little bit. I wasn't bored. I love history, so I enjoyed the history segment from the history lesson from Vladimir Putin. But
I could have done without it.
I think it's something that everybody should share to the normies. We have a bunch of clips that we're going to play here as well. That we picked out that we thought were important. I think that the 45-minute introduction history lesson is actually wasn't, at least I'm viewing it as it wasn't a good idea on Putin's side. Like, look, this is your chance to speak to the West, especially the American public. You got to understand that we have short attention spans in this country now, and you're going to lose people in the first 45 minutes of that. Which
and I guarantee you did. Yeah.
Right. Now, see, I enjoyed it, right? Because especially because right now I'm deep in I'm reading stuff about the Soviet Union anyway. Now I get to live hear from the fucking president of Russia, and about this stuff. So I found it interesting. But I felt like he had to make that case, not to me. I already know this shit. I already know the history about the war in Ukraine, and so do you to some extent, like to the normies and to the people who are don't know any of this stuff, and you're going to lose. And he did make those points, but he made them in the second half of the interview. So you're going to probably lose everybody in that first 45 minutes. Now, on second hand, he alludes to later, there might be an aspect of he doesn't give a fuck. I think because he later on says how you guys kind of already overplayed your hand. Our economy is number one in Europe. We have our alliance with China. They're doing good. You guys are $33 trillion in debt. So I think it was a little bit of swinging his dick around and look, I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about here. I'm not going to do the old-fashioned interview thing that you guys want to do. And we're going to do a long-form podcast here where I kind of just talk about history and whatever it is I want to do. So there might have been some of that to it as well.
Yeah. You could really tell, cheek and mouth, tongue in cheek, whatever the hell it is, with the whole Nord Stream thing. There's a third Nord Stream pipeline, but they just don't turn it on.
Yeah. There's
2 pipelines going through Poland. They just don't turn it on. Germany's actively not doing anything about it. Why is that? I did get a sense he was a bit smug on some things of well, I've already told you this. Well, this is a complicated question. I'm going to finish the first question. He was completely in control of it, that's for sure.
Yeah, I got that vibe. This is Tucker Carlson, right? And every other Tucker interview I've watched, Tucker leads the interview. Even with Trump, I felt like Tucker led the interview. I felt like this one, Putin really led the interview, and it went where he wanted it to go. Really a different vibe from other ones. Now, I did think Tucker did a good job, and he actually gave a combative interview. He didn't give and he didn't give this interview that people were making out to seem he was going to give. And we've even been, or at least I've been critical of him when he interviewed Trump, and I was like, oh my God, that was lame. It was all softballs to Trump. I wanted to see an interesting, in-depth, hard-hitting interview, and he didn't do that for Trump. He did do that here, and it was interesting. So let's start with the first part. Let's stick with the history lesson in the beginning. Just one. We have one clip from the history section of this thing because I don't want to spend too much time on the history portion of it. But
you'll lose people. You'll lose people
Yeah.
if we.
So
on my side, the screen share is small. It's your background with all. It's not the full screen of Twitter.
Let's try that again. Hold on. Sorry, folks. How about now? You see me again?
Yeah. Now it's the two of us.
Okay. Now let's go back. How about that?
Perfection.
All right. So let's play this, and then I'll give my thoughts on to why he gave this history lesson. This is about 1 minute, and he referenced, this is what made my ears go up, he references Stalin and the Soviet Union here, and it's tied into Ukraine. So let's play this, and then I'll give my thoughts, and you give your thoughts after.
So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine, and they still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
I'm not sure whether they should go back to the 1654 borders. But given Stalin's time, so-called Stalin's regime, which as many claim saw numerous violations of human rights and violations of the rights of other states, one may say that they could claim back those lands of theirs while having no right to do that. It is at least understandable.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine?
Never. I have never told him, not a single time.
All right, so why this?
I'm glad this was the clip because this was something I did want to talk about. But go ahead.
Sure. So why I found this interesting is because I'm reading about Soviet Union right now, and Putin takes a very critical stance of Joseph Stalin, which is interesting, being that he's in the line of kings. Putin, I guess you could say afterwards, of Stalin, and we've had many conversations on this podcast about World War II and history, and how I've made the point how Stalin was worse than Hitler. That doesn't forgive Hitler for anything or say that he was good. But if you think back to the way you learned history in high school, right? Like in World War II, and it was in World War II we teamed up with the Soviet Union and the Great Britain, and we overthrew Hitler because he was the bad guy, and all that, and yay. And they kind of, made him out to be like Stalin was the good guy. We were the good guys, the allies. Stalin
helped, so.
Yeah, he was fucking awful, right? He killed so many insane people that even Vladimir Putin here talks about
about civil rights,
human rights abuses under the Stalin regime. And so there's two ways that I look at this. Number one, I think that's an important point of history people don't think of critically. American leftists obviously don't ever think of things that way. They think communism was great, and it's all a lie about it being bad. Here you have the literal person in the Kremlin telling you that was bad, what happened back then. And then also, even in our standard textbooks, it's omitted how bad that time really was and how bad Stalin was. So I thought that was pretty telling right there. You don't really ever get that perspective, especially from the guy who's in charge of Russia.
No.
And again, the guy sitting in the Kremlin, the same place that Stalin sat back in the day. Number two, I think the history lesson in general was Putin trying to make the point that Ukraine's a made up place. It's not it's
what was the history terminology he used? He said it right in the beginning. It's not a real nation. It's not a real state. Ukraine used to represent the outsiders or the borders or something like that.
Right, like guys on the board,
the fringe society or something
like that, like soldiers on the border of Russia, defending Russia. So I think that's why he went into this 45-minute rant about the history of Russia. He was trying to lay the groundwork of this place is made up, it's invented, its people were Russian historically. It's always been part of Russia. Kiev, the Rus Vikings. Did you watch the Viking show? It wasn't exactly it wasn't exactly like, you know, accurate to history, but they alluded to like the Rus or the Russians, like the Rus Vikings, you know, had their kingdom in Kiev. It's kind of like the foundation of Russia way back, you know, in 800 and whatever, like fucking, you know, that time. So I think that's part of like the historical play he's trying to make it. Like, this place isn't a real place. Now, I would push back on that specifically. I'm an anarchist. What constitutes who gets to determine what a country is?
What's a state?
What's a real nation, or what's a state, right? Like, that's a question to you. What do you think?
Well, I mean, according to what's that book you made me read? Shit, I had
Anatomy of the State.
Anatomy of the State. The state's going to create itself no matter what. Once there's a group of people and a leader is chosen, and that leader chooses a few delegates to take on the problems of that new state, a state is developed. So no, there's no one coming from your anarchist point of view. There's no way, you know, we could take over your backyard with all of our friends and say, this is Legion land, you know, this is Doom Nation, and we have a state. Obviously, you know, America wouldn't allow that, but I felt more that alluded to, that's a pretty good reason Ukraine isn't an actual state or a country or whatever, a nation. And that's why it is such a corrupt nation that the elites use to their will, to their benefit. Places like Kazakhstan and Ukraine, we always hear about money laundering and all, you know, all the Joe Biden's corruption going on down there and stuff like that. So it was interesting to me to see that, like, this state was kind of possibly developed out of like opportunity. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a real state, so we could kind of get away with doing our black ops dirty work there from afar. That, and it also explains why Ukraine is so fucking important to every elite country around the world, because they get to run their corruption and money laundering schemes through there.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an aspect to that. I'm just going to take the stance on this history lesson is I actually disagree with Putin, even as an anarchist, right? Put that aside. I try not to be in that world too much on the podcast, but like, a bunch of people get together. They think that there are people. They think that they have a right to liberty and have their own state. They get to have a state. You don't get to come here later, you know, 1,400 years later and be like, well, you know, back 1,400 years ago, because then, then we could go and be like, well, the Native Americans, right? The Cherokee and blah, 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 and they had their state here and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, therefore they should really be the ones in charge here and whatever. So in present day, real world life, let's not be autistic, Vladimir Putin. You're being a little autistic here. Ukraine is a state with people who want to be independent from Russia, and it is what it is. Now, that's separate from the fact that they've been in a sort of civil war with themselves, you know, for the past 10 plus years, and the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donbass are more ethnically Russian, and they feel, you know, at least if you believe the whole story, that they feel more like they should be part of Russia. So this goes both ways, right? This goes both ways. Now, again, what did I just say before? What does it take, in a sense, in my opinion, at least to make a state? A bunch of people who feel a certain way want to make a state. They get to make a state or be part of another state. So it goes both ways in that sense. It's a civil war. And I do think he actually makes that point later. Like, look, this is like our own internal beef here between Russians, right? And get out of our business. Let us handle it, and we will handle it in time.
What did I just say before we started recording? That even Putin points out that, like, the president could want something, but if the CIA or the military-industrial complex wants something more, that's what's going to happen, and the president will be overridden. My only pushback on this is that, remember, towards the end, Putin talks about how they've accepted other religions like Islam and stuff, people who worship Islam, but they still call it Mother Russia. Then what's the difference here? You know what I mean? Like,
sure,
you get what I'm saying? Like, all these people could come to Russia and it's automatically Mother Russia to them, and they can practice whatever type of religion they want and live peacefully within the Russian borders, but Ukraine can't be Ukraine.
Yes, right. Well, you're kind of making my point. That's kind of contradictory what he's saying. I think this also
I don't disagree with you.
I think this also makes a point I've made a million times. Like the state's a construct; it's not a real thing. It's whatever people want it to be. And yeah, like in a sense, like he does make that point where, like, if there are, I think 20% of Russia is, believe in Islam. Like, theoretically, why can't they like have an Islamic state within Russia if they so choose to be so, right? So. There is an aspect to that. So in this history lesson thing, I don't agree with Putin's fundamental viewpoint of like that's part of Russia. It's not a real state. It doesn't get to exist. Therefore, that's some sort of justification for what I'm doing. I don't think that was the right argument to make. And like I'm looking for like the cold hard facts about policy and Western aggression towards them, which he does get into, which we are going to cover later. But I thought harping on history and the concept of the state and people's individual liberties, wrong, like way to start the interview if you're looking to make your case to the West, which leads me to believe maybe
because any progressive listener is going to be like, oh, now he's saying Ukraine's not even a real state.
Any progressive listening is too stupid to understand these concepts, probably. But like maybe people like us, or people with half of fucking their head screwed on right, be like, that's kind of like in bad taste to an extent. Yeah, if they weren't bored to death after the first 45 minutes.
I was in pain. I was in physical pain.
All right, so. You want to go on to the next point, next video?
What is your next point? Because there is something. Okay, so did you get any? Did you save any clips about eliminating denazification?
No, I remember that part. I didn't save any clips on it. But go ahead. We can just start chat about it off the top of our heads,
dude. Right away. When. It's so funny that like when this whole Ukraine war popped off, right away we were talking about the Azov Battalion, the Black Sun. We're getting strikes on YouTube and Twitter. We're spreading disinformation. And here's the president of Russia is like, there's a Nazi problem throughout Ukraine and stuff. And something that we want to do is denazify. And boy, let me tell you, I might not want to sit through one of Vlad's history lessons. But if the old KGB wants to fly old Cap out to Ukraine to take on some fucking Nazis, I will hammer and sickle the shit out of those motherfuckers. Bro, I was like,
your own Inglorious Bastards unit killing Nazis.
Yes, my own. Yes, that's what I want. I had my own little fantasy there, but I was like, it's just so. It's not strange or bizarre anymore at this point. It was in the past, but like. Me and you called this 2.5 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, and we've been denied what's the validation this entire time. And here's the president of Russia in an unrelated thing, just confirming what most people knew 2 years ago.
So I know exactly what you're saying, and I felt that way while I was watching this whole thing, but we started getting to a little bit more substance aspects of it. As like they were moving from topic to topic, I was laughing in the back of my head. I'm like, we covered that. We covered that on the podcast. We covered that. We covered that. We covered that. And we covered that. And I was like, and it's funny because it was vindicating in a way for us and for I'm sure others who have been covering this because now you have, like I'm saying, like the literal president of Russia stating these things that we had been speculating on. Not really. I guess speculating is not really the right word. Like the things we had been saying, like this is probably what it really is. Maybe it is speculating, whatever. But here he is now, and he's like confirming our suspicions about their motivations in a way over this whole